Constantinople was supposed to be untouchable. Its walls had broken empires. Its gates had outlasted centuries of war. But on this day, the city stood closer to collapse than anyone inside would admit. An enemy army gathered outside the walls. The empire was divided, the defences were stretched thin, and if the gates fell, the Byzantine world would fall with them. Standing between survival and annihilation was a force that did not belong to the empire at all. Foreign warriors, armed with axes, bound by oath, and feared even by those they protected. This is the story of the Varangian Guard, and the day they held the line when Constantinople nearly fell. Constantinople was not supposed to be afraid. For centuries its walls had defied empires, its harbours had swallowed enemy fleets. Its name alone carried weight, whispered with reverence in distant courts, and cursed by would-be conquerors. Yet now, as dawn broke over the Bosphorus, fear crept through the streets like a slow-moving fog. The city was surrounded. From the battlements sentries watched banners ripple in the distance. Foreign colours, unfamiliar standards. Ships crowded the horizon. Somewhere beyond the hills, armies gathered, tightening their grip with every passing hour. Inside the city, merchants shuttered their stalls. Priests murmured prayers. Messengers ran breathless through marble corridors, carrying news that grew darker with each step. If Constantinople fell, the world would tilt, and standing between survival and annihilation was a force unlike any other in the empire. They were not born Romans, they did not speak Greek as their first tongue, and they did not fight for the empire out of loyalty to its people. They fought for gold, they fought for honour, they fought because once they took an oath, they never broke it. They were the Varangian Guard. The Byzantine Empire in this moment was powerful, but fragile. From the outside, Constantinople appeared eternal. Its massive Theodosian walls, layered in stone and reinforced by towers, had repelled sieges for nearly 1,000 years. The city controlled the narrow straits between Europe and Asia, dominating trade routes that funneled wealth from the known world into its coffers. But inside those walls, cracks were forming. Court intrigue was constant. Emperors rose and fell not only to enemies abroad but to conspiracies at home. Generals schemed, nobles whispered, alliances shifted with alarming speed. The empire still stood, but it stood on a knife's edge. Beyond the borders, rivals watched carefully. To the north and west came warriors hardened by cold seas and endless forests. To the east and south stood long-standing enemies who had studied the city's defences for generations. Everyone knew the same truth. Constantinople was the prize. And when the empire showed weakness, the world moved in. The Varangian Guard had been created for moments like this. Long before this crisis, Byzantine emperors learned a painful lesson. Roman soldiers could be bribed. Greek officers could be persuaded. Ambitious men inside the empire often proved more dangerous than enemies beyond it. So the emperors looked elsewhere. They turned to the north, beyond the familiar world, where warriors were bound not by politics but by reputation. Men who came from lands where betrayal was punished swiftly, and loyalty was everything. Vikings, Rus, Norsemen. Outsiders whose allegiance could not be bought by rival factions inside Constantinople. These men formed the emperor's personal bodyguard. They swore their loyalty not to generals or governors, but directly to the throne. They were paid well, equipped with the finest arms and stationed at the very heart of imperial power. When emperors slept, the Varangians stood watch. When coups were attempted, it was Varangian axes that decided the outcome. They were feared. They were respected. And when war came to the gates, they were unleashed. As enemy forces gathered around Constantinople, the empire faced a brutal reality. The regular army was stretched thin. Frontiers across Anatolia demanded troops. Naval forces were scattered. Political unrest had drained confidence in commanders whose loyalties were uncertain. In the event of a full-scale assault, the empire could not rely solely on numbers, it would rely on resolve. Inside the palace, strategists argued late into the night. Some urged caution, others pushed for negotiations. A few whispered that the city could not withstand a prolonged siege, but the emperor knew better. The walls would hold, if the men behind them did not break. And so orders were given. The Varangian Guard was to take position at the most critical points of the defence, gates, towers, and narrow approaches where a small number of men could decide the fate of thousands. They were not spread thin. They were concentrated where failure was not an option. As the first enemy probes began, the Varangians prepared. They were taller than most Byzantine soldiers, broader in the shoulders, hardened by lives of constant warfare. Their armour was practical, brutal and unmistakable. Chainmail hung heavy across their frames. Helmets bore scars from earlier battles, and in their hands they carried the weapon that made their reputation legendary. The axe, long-handled, heavy-bladed, capable of splitting shields and armour alike. In close quarters, on walls, in gates, in streets, the axe was devastating. Against disciplined infantry, it shattered formations. Against cavalry, it ripped riders from their mounts. The Varangians trained for this kind of fighting. They did not panic under pressure. They did not retreat unless ordered. And when commanded to hold a position, they held it, no matter the cost. The first clashes were testing blows. Enemy forces advanced cautiously, probing weak points, searching for gaps in the defences. Archers exchanged fire. Siege engines were positioned. Drums echoed across the fields outside the city, their rhythm steady and relentless. From the walls, defenders watched in silence. When assaults came, they came suddenly. Ladders rose against stone. Siege towers rolled forward under covering fire. At narrow gates, attackers surged in waves, hoping sheer momentum would carry them through. This was where the Varangians excelled. At choke points where numbers meant nothing, they stood shoulder to shoulder, axes rising and falling in brutal rhythm. Shields shattered, helmets split. Men fell screaming into the dust below the walls. Again and again the attackers were thrown back. But the enemy did not withdraw. They regrouped, they learned, and they returned with greater force. Inside Constantinople the mood shifted. At first confidence had reigned. The city had faced sieges before, but as days turned into weeks, supplies tightened. Casualties mounted. Fires burned where enemy projectiles found their mark. Rumours spread. Some claimed the emperor was preparing to flee, others whispered of betrayal among the nobility. Each new assault carried not only physical danger, but psychological strain. This was exactly what the attackers wanted. Sieges were not won by force alone. They were won by breaking the will of the defenders, and slowly the strain began to show. The Varangians did not waver. They rotated shifts, cleaned their weapons, and prepared for the next assault with grim patience. To them, this was what they had been hired for. They were not defending homes or families within the city. They were defending their oath, and that made them relentless. When night assaults came, they fought in torchlight and shadow. When breaches were tested, they sealed them with bodies and steel. When lesser troops faltered, the Varangians advanced instead, their presence alone steadying the line. But even they could feel the pressure building. The enemy was planning something larger, something decisive. Beyond the walls siege commanders gathered. They had learned where the Varangians stood. They understood their strength and their limitations. The solution was simple, if costly. Overwhelm them. A coordinated assault would strike multiple points at once. Diversions would draw defenders away from key gates. When the moment came, elite enemy troops would push forward with everything they had. If the Varangians broke, even briefly the city would fall. And so preparations were made. Unbeknownst to the men on the walls, the most dangerous day of the siege was approaching, a day that would decide the fate of Constantinople, and test whether the Varangian Guard truly deserved its legend. The assault began before sunrise, not with a roar, but with a rhythm. A low beat of drums rolled across the fields outside Constantinople, slow at first, like a distant heartbeat, then faster still, until it became a constant pulse that pressed into the nerves of every man standing watch on the walls. Torches dotted the darkness beyond the moat, thousands of flames swaying in the cold air, moving like a living tide. The enemy had not come to test the city today. They had come to take it. A horn sounded, long and harsh. Then the world below the walls erupted. The first wave was not the real strike. It was bait. From multiple directions, enemy infantry surged forward, carrying ladders and wooden shields overhead. Archers behind them loosed volleys in thick black arcs, the arrows falling like rain against stone and steel. Siege engines, already positioned days earlier, began hurling stones and flaming pitch in heavy, deliberate rhythm. The defenders reacted on instinct. Men ran to the battlements. Commands were shouted. Bowstrings snapped. Rocks were dropped. Boiling liquids were poured. The walls shook under impacts that felt like the fists of giants. Along the towers and gates, officers screamed for reinforcements. and for a moment it looked like the enemy was attacking everywhere. That was the point. Inside the city, messengers sprinted between defensive sectors, breathless and wide-eyed. North wall, ladders. South sector, tower advancing, gate fire, siege ram incoming. Each new report dragged soldiers away from somewhere else. Units shifted, reserves thinned. The defenders were being pulled like threads, stretched tighter and tighter. The enemy was building pressure, preparing to strike the real target. And only a few commanders recognized the pattern. The Emperor's strategists had warned of this. A multi-point assault meant one thing. A decisive push was coming. Somewhere. At the gate known for being the most vulnerable, an approach where the land rose slightly and siege engines could be moved more easily, the Varangian Guard stood ready. They had been placed there deliberately, the way a blacksmith places an iron bar directly under the hammer. This was the place the enemy would choose if they wanted a breakthrough, and the Varangians knew it. They did not speak much as they waited. No speeches, no prayers whispered to impress the men beside them. Just the quiet ritual of warriors who had lived through too many battles to romanticize the next one. They checked straps, adjusted grips, tightened helmets. They listened, and what they heard was different today. The enemy wasn't shouting randomly, they were coordinating. The sound beyond the gate was organized, measured, like a machine gearing up. Then it hit. A siege ram slammed into the gate with a crack that echoed through the stone passages behind it. Dust shook loose from the ceiling. This second impact came before the first vibration faded, then a third, then a fourth. Each strike felt like the gate was being punched by a giant. Byzantine soldiers braced behind barricades, spears were lowered, ready to stab through gaps if the wood splintered. Archers positioned themselves to fire into the entryway the moment it opened. But the Varangians did not take position behind the barricade, they took position in front of it, where they could be seen, where the enemy would understand exactly what they were about to face. Above the gate, defenders poured missiles downward. The enemy answered with concentrated arrow fire, so heavy it forced men to keep their heads low behind the parapets. Siege towers rolled closer, ladders climbed the walls in clusters, and then, like a blade sliding into a gap in armor, an elite enemy formation moved toward the gate under heavy cover. This was the true push. Their best troops, their most disciplined fighters. Men chosen because they could keep moving even while others died around them. They came with hooks, axes, and heavy tools. They came to breach. The ram struck again. The gate groaned. A seam split down one side. And the defenders inside felt it. Felt the moment approaching where wood would fail and the battle would pour into the streets. When the gate finally cracked open, it did not swing wide. It shuddered, sagged, and split enough for men to force themselves through. The first enemy soldiers squeezed into the opening, shouting, trying to create momentum. Their goal was simple: get a foothold inside the gatehouse, widen the breach, flood in. The first man through raised his shield, and a Varangian axe came down like judgment. The blade struck the shield, crushed through it, and continued into the man behind it. He fell in the doorway, blocking others for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat the Varangians surged forward. They did not wait to be overwhelmed. They attacked first. The gatehouse turned into a slaughterhouse. Fighting in tight spaces is different from fighting in open fields. There is no room for elegant formations, no wide maneuvers, no flanking charges. It becomes raw physics, steel, muscle, breath, and panic. The Varangians were built for it. They fought in pairs and small clusters, using their size to control space, using their axes to keep enemy shields from forming a wall. Every swing forced the enemy to step back or die. At the breach, attackers tried to push forward in a wave. The Varangians absorbed it, then threw it back. Bodies piled up in the doorway, the entrance clogged. Enemy officers screamed for men to keep moving, and those men looked into the gatehouse and hesitated, because what they saw wasn't a fight. It was a grinder. But the enemy did not stop. They shifted tactics. Instead of forcing the breach wider immediately, they attacked the walls above the gate with renewed fury. Ladders rose again, dozens at once, siege towers slammed against stone, hooks caught the parapets. They were trying to split the defenders, overwhelm the wall while the gatehouse remained contested. If they could take the section above, they could drop ropes and men into the interior passages. They could attack the Varangians from above and behind. A brilliant move, a brutal one, and for the first time that day the defenders began to break. Not the Varangians, the regular troops around them. On the battlements above the gate, Byzantine soldiers faced wave after wave. Some fought hard, others faltered under the sheer violence of it. A ladder would rise and men would climb. Defenders would hack at hands and heads, but 2 more ladders would appear beside it. Arrows slammed into shields, stones crushed helmets. Men fell backwards screaming, dragging others down with them. The line bent, and bending in a siege is the beginning of breaking. A small group of attackers reached the parapet. They vaulted over, and suddenly Byzantine defenders were fighting inside their own wall line. Panic sparked like fire in dry straw. This was the moment the enemy had designed. If the wall above the gate collapsed, the Varangians would be trapped, attacked from the rear, cut off, destroyed. And once the Varangians were gone, the gatehouse would fall. Once the gatehouse fell, the city was finished. Deep inside the city, civilians would not see the breach coming. By the time the alarm spread, enemy troops would already be pouring through streets, seizing intersections, setting fires, taking hostages, killing anyone who resisted. Constantinople's defenders understood this. They could feel it. The entire empire balanced on this one section of wall. A Byzantine officer ran down into the gatehouse, blood on his cheek, eyes wide. "The wall's failing, they're coming over." He didn't finish the sentence because the Varangian captain had already seen it. The captain, broad-shouldered, chainmail dark with sweat, turned his head slightly as another enemy soldier fell in front of him. Then he shouted a command that cut through the chaos. Half the Varangians pivoted instantly, not away from the breach, toward the stairway leading to the battlements, to fight upward. They moved like a machine. Axes were slung, shields grabbed, men shoved past wounded soldiers and stunned archers. They climbed the stone stairs 2 at a time, their boots pounding like thunder. At the top, the scene was almost worse than the gatehouse. The battlements were crowded, slippery with blood. Bodies lay tangled with ladders. Smoke drifted in from burning pitch. And attackers, enemy elites, were already inside the wall line, hacking down defenders who had no space to reform. The Varangians hit them like a storm. The first axe swing split a helmet clean enough that the man inside collapsed without even screaming. A second blow broke a spear shaft and the ribs behind it. The Varangians did not form a neat line. They formed a wedge. They pushed into the enemy cluster and tore it apart with aggressive, close-range brutality. And the defenders around them, seeing it, regained their nerve. This wasn't just fighting, it was psychological warfare. War is won by the side that believes it will win. For hours, Byzantine troops had been pushed and pulled, rattled by simultaneous attacks, unsure where the real danger was. They had felt themselves losing control of the situation. Now they saw the Varangians, big as statues, moving forward through chaos as if it meant nothing. And something changed. Men grabbed shields again. They tightened formation. They stepped back into the line instead of retreating. The wall steadied. But the enemy commanders were not fools. They recognized what was happening, and they committed the last reserve. A fresh wave surged toward the ladders. Siege tower ramps dropped again. The assault intensified with a violence that felt almost desperate. Because for the attackers, time was shrinking. Sieges cost money. They cost men. They cost morale. The longer the city held, the more likely reinforcements would arrive, the more likely politics would shift, the more likely the entire campaign would collapse. They needed a breakthrough now, so they threw everything at the gate sector, and the Varangians, bloodied and exhausted, were forced into the hardest kind of fight, holding the line while slowly running out of strength. Inside the gatehouse, the remaining Varangians continued the grind at the breach. Outside, the enemy rams struck again and again, widening the split. More attackers forced their way in, climbing over bodies as if they were stepping over broken furniture. The Varangians fought without pause, but even they could not deny it. The pressure was increasing. If the enemy could push just a few more feet into the gatehouse, the fight would spill into the street beyond. Once the street was compromised, defenders would have to fall back to secondary positions, and retreat inside a city is a dangerous thing. Retreat becomes collapse. The Varangian captain understood this. He wasn't thinking about glory. He was thinking about geometry, about space, about the difference between holding a doorway and fighting in an open street. If the enemy broke into the city proper, the advantage would shift. So the captain made a decision that would either save Constantinople or kill every Varangian in that gatehouse. He ordered a countercharge, not a retreat, not a reshuffle, a forward push straight into the breach. The Varangians tightened their formation, shields forward, axes raised. They surged into the broken doorway, driving attackers backward step by step, forcing them out of the entryway and into the narrow space outside. It was insane. It was brilliant, because it turned the breach into a choke point again, this time choking the attackers outside, compressing them into a killing lane where their numbers became useless. And as the Varangians held that line outside the gatehouse, Byzantine archers above finally regained clear shots. Arrows poured down into the clustered attackers. Stones followed. The enemy formations, tight and packed, became a trap for themselves. Men fell. Others stumbled over them. Panic rippled through the front ranks. For the first time all day, the enemy push stalled. But stalling was not the same as ending. The attackers regrouped again, trying to widen their formations, trying to pull back siege engines and reset. Their commanders screamed. Their drums hammered harder. They were furious. They had come too far to be denied now. They launched another concentrated push. The Varangians met it head-on. Steel crashed. Wood splintered. Men screamed. Smoke thickened. The entire world narrowed to a few feet of space, a few heartbeats, and the raw certainty that if they stepped back even once, Constantinople would bleed. And then suddenly something changed. A new horn sounded from within the city. Not the enemy. The Empire. A different tone. A signal. Reinforcements were moving. Fresh Byzantine troops, reserves held back for exactly this moment, were arriving behind the Varangian position, flooding into the gate sector with shields up and spears ready. The Varangians were no longer alone. The line thickened. The defenders pressed forward with renewed strength, and the attackers, after hours of brutal fighting, began to waver. They had expected the city to crack. Instead, it hardened. The enemy commander made one last attempt, a final surge. Everything left. They threw men at the breach until bodies stacked high enough to form their own ramp. They tried to climb over the dead. They tried to push through a wall of axes and spears. It nearly worked. For a moment the Varangian line bent. A Varangian went down. Another stumbled. A gap opened, and the captain stepped into it, axe raised, and closed it with violence so absolute it stunned the attackers into hesitation. That hesitation was fatal. The defenders surged, and the enemy front finally broke. Not completely, not a rout, but a collapse of momentum. A retreat of the assault line, a pulling back of ladders, a dragging away of wounded, a desperate attempt to salvage what they could. The siege engines fell silent one by one. The drums slowed, then stopped. The field outside Constantinople was littered with bodies. The gatehouse stank of blood and smoke. The battlements were scarred and broken, but still standing. And the city, shaken, battered, exhausted, had survived the most dangerous day of the siege. But no one inside the walls celebrated, because everyone understood the truth. This wasn't the end. It was the turning point. The enemy had thrown their best punch and failed. Now they would have to decide whether to bleed the city slowly, or withdraw, and inside Constantinople, the Empire had to decide whether it would simply endure or strike back. The silence after the assault felt unreal. For hours, Constantinople had been a city under constant impact. Drums pounding, horns screaming, stones shattering, men shouting over one another in the smoke. Now, as the enemy pulled back, the absence of noise rang louder than any battle cry. From the walls, defenders watched cautiously as the attackers regrouped at a distance. Ladders lay broken where they had fallen. Siege towers smouldered, some abandoned midfield. The ground beyond the moat was dark with bodies, armour glinting faintly in the early light. The city still stood, but it stood on exhaustion. Inside the gatehouse, the Varangian Guard took stock of the cost. Men leaned against stone walls, breathing hard, blood soaking into chainmail. Some had wounds they hadn't yet felt. Others sat quietly beside fallen comrades, hands resting on axe hafts as if unsure what to do without the fight to anchor them. They had held, but barely. If the assault had lasted another hour, another 30 minutes, the outcome might have been different. Strength had been pushed to its limits. Discipline had been all that remained, and discipline alone had saved Constantinople. Word of the failed assault spread quickly through the city. Messengers ran to the palace. Officers reported to commanders. Priests emerged from churches to tend the wounded. Civilians crept cautiously back into the streets, staring in disbelief at the damage, at the scars carved into stone that had once seemed invincible. Morale shifted, not to celebration, but to resolve. The defenders had seen what the enemy could do, and the enemy had seen what they could not break. Outside the walls, the attackers faced a harsher reality. The siege had already cost them heavily. Elite troops, men meant to survive the worst fighting, had been spent in a single, failed push. Supplies were dwindling. Wounded men crowded field camps. Commanders argued bitterly over next steps. They could not pretend this was going according to plan anymore. Constantinople had not cracked. It had absorbed the blow. And absorbing a blow is what fortresses are meant to do. Sieges are wars of patience. The longer they last, the more pressure shifts to the attackers. Armies in the field must be fed. Morale must be maintained. Disease must be managed. Political pressure at home grows as casualties mount without victory. The enemy commanders understood this. They had tried to win quickly and failed. Now they faced an unappealing choice: stay and bleed slowly, hoping the city would eventually weaken, or withdraw, preserving what remained of their force. The Varangian Guard had forced that decision. Inside Constantinople, the emperor convened his council. The question was no longer whether the city could hold. It was whether the empire should seize the momentum. Scouts reported that enemy formations were reorganizing defensively, not offensively. Siege engines were being repositioned farther from the walls. Patrols had grown cautious. Attacks had slowed to sporadic probes rather than full assaults. These were not signs of confidence. They were signs of doubt. The emperor's advisors urged caution. The city had survived, but barely. To launch a counterattack would risk what had just been saved. But the Varangian Guard argued differently. They had faced the enemy at their strongest, and endured. Now, they said, the enemy was tired. Now was the moment to press. The emperor approved a limited action, not a reckless charge, a calculated strike. Byzantine forces would harass enemy supply lines, strike isolated camps, and force the attackers to spread their already thin manpower even thinner. Naval patrols increased along the coast, disrupting transport. Cavalry units probed the perimeter, keeping pressure constant, and at the heart of it all the Varangians remained visible, unmoved at the walls, a silent threat that reminded the enemy what waited if they tried again. The psychological effect was devastating. Every movement the attackers made felt watched. Every delay felt dangerous. Days passed, then a week. No full assault came. The drums stayed silent. Instead, scouts began reporting something unexpected. Enemy units were pulling back, not all at once, but steadily. Siege towers dismantled, camps thinned, supply convoys rerouted away from the city. The siege was unravelling. The attackers had lost the initiative, and they knew they would not get it back. When the enemy finally withdrew beyond striking distance, the city did not erupt into chaos. There was no riot of celebration, no wild rush into the streets. Instead, Constantinople exhaled. The empire had been pushed to the edge and stepped back. The walls still stood. The gates were still closed, and at their posts, axes resting against stone, the Varangian Guard remained exactly where they had been, uncelebrated, unmoved. In the aftermath, historians would debate tactics and numbers. They would analyse siege engines, troop movements, political calculations. They would argue over how close the city truly came to falling. But the men who stood on the walls did not debate. They remembered the sound of the gate cracking. They remembered the moment when fear almost took hold, and they remembered who stood firm when everything else bent. The Varangian Guard's legacy was not built on conquest. They did not march under their own banners. They did not carve out kingdoms. They did not write their own histories. They stood where emperors needed them most. They held when retreat would have been easier. They fought not for land or faith, but for the weight of an oath. And because of that, Constantinople endured. Not because it was unbreakable, but because, on its worst day, it was defended by men who refused to break. Long after the siege faded into memory, travellers would still marvel at the city's walls. They would walk the battlements and run their hands along scarred stone, wondering how such a place could have survived so many enemies. The answer was not just stone. It was steel. It was discipline. It was the Varangian Guard, standing in the narrow places where empires are either saved or lost.